I'm really glad we could come together to have this conversation, thinking about the future of work, the future of education, future workforce, the future workplace. I think it's a really interesting topic, and we've got a good group here to have a discussion from a number of different perspectives. Um, our our objective is really to think through like three questions. First, what is the next generation looking for in terms of work? What do today's students look for as tomorrow's workforce? And then secondly, what can tomorrow's employers and even today's employers do to meet those expectations to get ready today and tomorrow? And then third, what can colleges and universities do to best prepare today's students for tomorrow's work? We'll go through this kind of flow. For each of those questions, I'll talk for maybe 5 minutes and present, I think, some interesting data and insights from our work. Every year we do a national student experience survey. So we kind of take the pulse of students across the country, how they're doing, how they're feeling, what they're thinking. We've recently done a couple of projects for tech companies thinking about, trying to take like a forward-thinking approach to their return to office strategy. And then we also do research, and we, find and compile the research of others. So we'll share the deck when this is done. There's lots of fun links in there. And if you want to geek out on the data, you can do that. I think it's interesting, today's students are tomorrow's workforce. And actually the majority of students work during college, so they're also kind of today's workforce. And one of the things we found in this year's National Student Experience Study, where we take a representative sample, and we look at 68 different dimensions of student experience, and we understand the relationships among them. Growth is the best indicator of student satisfaction. So if students feel like they're growing, then they're happy with their classes, they're happy with the community, the culture, even the facilities. There's a very strong correlation between the two. And we talk about growth the way it's defined in the literature, where people are gaining skills, knowledge, they're feeling challenged, they're working on a team, they're gaining confidence, and they're able to apply what they're learning. And the problem is not all students, or maybe not enough students, feel that sense of growth. Really only only 2/3 of students have that. And it varies a lot by type of institution and type of student. So for instance, like students at private institutions seem to be more satisfied with their growth than at publics. Women more so than men. Adult learners more so than 18 to 20, 24-year-olds, 21-year-olds. Interestingly, that idea of growth, it translates into the workplace, because that's actually the key thing they're looking for in the future. When we ask them, like, what do you want in tomorrow's work? Growth, advancement, that's at the top of their list as well. So growth is really the thing to be thinking about. And what's interesting is sometimes it means you have to do things differently, or sometimes you just have to communicate differently, because a lot of times you don't realize you're growing unless you have some kind of moment of reflection, some chance to realize what you've learned, how you've learned it, why you've learned it, had a chance to apply it. Because in hindsight, 66% of students are satisfied with their growth. But if you look at national surveys, it's like 80 to 90% of grads feel like they grew a lot in college and value the experience. So some of that could just be like the disconnect or hindsight being 2020. But there's certainly things we can do to foreground that. And interestingly, when you think about how students are learning quite flexibly, and we'll get to that in a second, they're also bringing those expectations for flexibility into the workplace. So when we did a national survey of Gen Z to help this global tech company think about return to office, they felt a lot of the same reasons for coming to an office that that folks, the workplace overall would feel, but they didn't feel it as strongly. So yes, an inspiring job and an interesting program and building relationships and innovative technology, flexible workplaces, these are all attractors, but much less strongly than the workforce in general. And they're more likely to want a hybrid schedule, 22% more likely to want a hybrid schedule. And that could be part of that. They're valuing freedom and flexibility as their top, in a rank order question about their workplace values. And part of that is that they're learning a lot more flexibly, especially, this was already happening, but the pandemic accelerated that. So when you ask students about where and how they want to learn, there's much more interest in online, blended, hybrid forms of learning. So overall, in aggregate, students only want 43% of their classes entirely in person. They're looking for digital online components in a blend or a hybrid. Blend meaning you do some in person and some online. Hybrid meaning you've got a combination of people that are remote and in the room together. And so, but that also varies. If you have a student with disabilities, you want more online. If you're a part-time student, if you're an adult learner, you want more online. So the flexible learning is setting expectations for flexible working. And in the same way that students are looking for ways to find that and thinking about how they're going to connect with colleagues in the workplace, they're also really thinking about belonging, connection, community on campus. And only about 2/3 of students, 65% of students, feel a sense of belonging. There's a great survey, which is called the National College Health Assessment, that looks at tens of thousands of students every year. And it's pretty consistently been at about 2/3 feel a sense of belonging, which leaves a lot of folks out. So colleges and universities are working on that. They're thinking about programming and places and people and affinity groups and spaces for student veterans and first-gen students and LGBTQ plus communities and all sorts of other ways that students identify and they find their people. But there's still work to do. And finally, one, I think, key demographic to be thinking about as we're thinking about the future workforce, the future workplace, are students with disabilities, which is about 1/5 of all students report some kind of disability, which could be cognitive, could be physical, could be ADHD, could be mobility issues. And what really jumped off the page in our latest survey was not only that students were interested in growth, but also that students with disabilities had a much less equitable or much less effective experience on 30 plus of the metrics that we track. They have a statistically significant difference and big gaps around time management, access to facilities, orientation, study facilities. And so that's the future workforce that's going to require more and different kinds of support. And given that students with disabilities want much more prefer online learning, they're also going to be preferring more remote work and hybrid work options, which is actually already playing out. I think there's really interesting data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics showing workforce participation among people with disabilities is at an all-time high because of changes that the pandemic brought about. So that's maybe a bright spot in all of this. So now, Act 2, what can we do to meet these expectations? So I think the first thing is welcome. Sit anywhere you'd like. The first thing is thinking about a return on commute, right? So this is like a return on investment, but it's a return on commute. You have to make it worth getting up and going to the office. Speaking of adapting, and what's great is we actually know a lot about what matters in person. And earlier I was talking about, there's research we've done, but there's also research we've found. And one of my favorite reports is this Microsoft Moments That Matter research. Has anybody heard about this? It's definitely worth checking out. It's their internal and external research of lessons learned from the pandemic and hybrid work. And one of the things they looked at is like what matters in person. Turns out meeting your manager in person, like as part of orientation and onboarding, has huge impacts. Like you're much more likely to seek and accept feedback. You're better growth. The other thing that matters a lot is brainstorming. They looked at their own work. They looked at this study in Nature where people in person can come up with more ideas, and they rate those ideas independently. Those ideas are rated as more creative. So really think about what can people do in person, and make that the return on commute. Doing that means there's a shift in space, in the kinds, the types, the amounts of space. It means more social space, because that's a real reason to connect. I think one of the things that's kind of in the zeitgeist is the idea that like people are the most valuable amenity in the workplace. And I think from that Microsoft research, I think it was like 85% of people, when asked different drivers to come into the office, that was the highest rated one, other people. So space for those people to work, and that space has to come from somewhere. So it probably means you're kind of reconfiguring individual space and shifting it to more collaborative space. You're shifting from assigned space to more shared space to get, to basically create a surplus that you can use for the kind of community we were talking about. And it also means that you have to more actively like monitor and measure the space so that you can make these adjustments to make sure kind of that the type, amount, the use of the space is matching what people are looking for. And I think part of how you create that return on commute, you create active, vibrant places that people want to be in, is through the support services that are offered. And I think one of the really interesting trends is as students have changed, as technology have changed, as college has gotten more complicated, students are supported by a whole range of services: academic, administrative, personal, professional, everything from, if you think about a student working on a project, right? Maybe they're getting support on writing the script for a skit. They're looking at data visualization. They're getting help making the presentation. Maybe they're talking to an advisor. Maybe they're talking to a student success coach who's helping them manage their time or learn study skills. Maybe they're talking to a counselor. And so there's a whole sort of support enterprise or network on the campus that's setting expectations for the future workplace. And I think this is an opportunity to like better support the future worker, but also to energize spaces. And one of the really interesting things we found, we just did this space utilization study where we got anonymized sensor data from 38 universities over a couple of years. And we looked at libraries, you'll like this one, libraries that have these support functions in them are used much more. They're actually used 20 to 25% more because, there's more reasons to be there and you're meeting students where they are. And so if you think about like the future employee hub, it's not just like a place for coffee and cake, right? It's also a place for counseling and coaching, and using the services as another way to get that return on commute, that draw. Obviously, some of these can be delivered remotely. You can meet with a coach anywhere online, but there's also value in doing it in person. And so that means as the space shifts, as it gets more energized, as you introduce support services, like people, I think to the point earlier, everyone is a special snowflake. They're gonna. Some people focus in a lively environment. Some people can't do it unless they can hear a pin drop and it's a silent environment. So you're providing more choice, And people, I think, are becoming more comfortable with the idea that they're not going to have an assigned space, as part of the kind of give and take to then have more choices in where and how they work. On this return to office study we just did, only 20% of the workforce, this was in tech, so it can it can vary, but only 20% was expecting an assigned space. So that's definitely a shift. The other thing that's shifting, once you create this variety, you have these services, you change the space to be more social, more collaborative. The other thing that's shifting are the norms to use the space. And I think of spaces like the hardware, and the norms and culture are like the software. And you need both to actually make it run, make it work. And one thing that's quite overlooked is having like an intentional conversation, a process, change management, whatever you want to call it, to help people articulate how they want to work in a space, how they want to use the space. And it's so important. And we actually did a study for a different tech company that was grappling with these issues of norms, particularly around focus, because some people are coming to the office to concentrate and others are coming to socialize. And those, that can be like oil and water. We took them through a process of just articulating what it is they wanted to do, distilling some guiding principles, and coming up with some a few rules to talk about how to help each other focus. And their satisfaction with being able to concentrate went up 71% without changing the space at all. So just looking at the software piece of it. And I think finally, as we're thinking about the impact on people of these shifts, of these choices, but I think the impact on planet is also quite significant. This is a study recently published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that talks about the reduction in carbon emissions from hybrid and remote work. And it's pretty significant. If you're 2 days a week remote, as your folks are asking for, that's an 11% reduction. And we actually think these are conservative because this is just looking at energy and commute. It's actually not looking at the embodied carbon of the facilities, because if you have less need, then you have less space and you build less. So I think thinking about the sustainability impact of remote and hybrid work, as well as online and blended learning, is critical. So Act 3, what can universities do to think about best preparing students, the next generation workforce, for this future of work? I think the first thing is really thinking about teamwork, because what's interesting is more and more students are working on group projects in classes, but there's often nothing more than the assignment given. There's no scaffolding, there's no framework, there's no training about how to work in the team. And increasingly, universities, colleges are trying to rectify this. It might be the Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence, or it might be a specific program, but they're talking about getting together, get a shared understanding of the goals, set the milestones, assign the roles, think about how you're going to check in, think about where and how you're going to work digitally and physically, and just like a little bit of tips and tactics and training goes a long way to improving group work. And this is something that really needs improvement, because of the 68 student experience metrics we track, working with peers outside of class is the absolute lowest, at 42% satisfaction among students. So it's kind of like jumps off the page. The other thing is, as students are working in teams, have those teams work on real world projects. So like, imagine you're teaching a marketing class, right? You could make a social media strategy for a fictitious company, or you could find a startup in the community, a local nonprofit, who needs strategy, who needs a logo, needs a brand. And all of a sudden you're solving real problems with and for real people. You're building relationships, you're building skills. And I'll do this. So we're alternating. So I'm not cutting everybody off. Um, and and so as you're doing that, you're not just building the skills, but you're making those connections, because like maybe that nonprofit needs an intern this summer, for instance. And those real world projects, they have huge impact. It's interesting. One study I found, you get about a 10K salary bump having done those kinds of projects, because now you have them in your portfolio, and you're probably finding a better fit, to your point earlier about your company. Whether it's through those projects or other parts, you can support those teams, support those students with mentoring. And this is another thing that's pretty low satisfaction in the 50s among students, and has huge potential. And it might be peer mentoring, a senior with a first year, or it might be faculty and staff. And there's lots of great research on the impact of mentoring. For instance, like faculty researchers at Elon University found that students with 7 to 10 connections were much more likely I think 3 times more likely to find their education rewarding and worth it. And Gallup has also found this, but only 48% of students are satisfied with mentoring. And to our discussion earlier, another way to have this overlap between work and school, experiential learning, kind of extend those real world projects out, is to think about internships, because they're really a way to give you a chance to apply, to make those connections, have an impact. But only less than a third of students complete internships, and only about half are satisfied. And it's a huge opportunity, because you're twice as likely to be engaged at work after graduation. And this is where universities, colleges can really lean into their career services, which is unfortunately often the best kept secret on campus. Students will, they go to career services in their senior year instead of in their first year to start exploring, to start planning. And but the students that actually go to career services and find it helpful, they're much more likely to think their education was worth the cost. They're much more likely to actually donate and give back to their university, and they're more satisfied at work. I think in the same way that hybrid work should be part of the sustainability strategy for a company, so can flexible learning prepare students for hybrid work, but also provide reductions in carbon emissions. And we did a study recently where we looked at the footprint of a on-campus versus online MBA student, and online was less than half in terms of the carbon emissions. So it's a way to take less space, use less energy, travel less, and kind of get students ready for a new flexible world of work while doing it in a more sustainable way. And finally, we're thinking about the support for students. And one of the interesting things that's happening among universities is they're providing more and more support, which is great. But then that support can make things actually more and more confusing and complicated, because then you don't know where to go, right? Like if you're a first-gen student veteran, like what's your front door? Is it the Veterans Center, or is it the first-gen center, for instance? Or like maybe you're a transfer student, so maybe you should go to the transfer center. So what's happening is there's a lot of special centers, services, departments to meet different student needs, but it can become quite confusing to where to go for what. And the more students can go to one place, and the more colleges and universities can meet them where they are, the better the outcomes. And there's one great study that Rand did that found that bringing together all the administrative functions actually results in a 3% retention bump, which is huge. because nationally, only 4/5 of students continue on from their first to second year. So if you can close that 20% gap by 3%, just by putting the place where you pay a bill, get financial aid, talk to your advisor in one place, like that's a huge impact. And really appreciate everybody's time and insights. Hopefully this was a useful discussion for you thinking about today and tomorrow, and today's students, tomorrow's workforce, tomorrow's workplace. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming, for everything you contributed.